Have you ever wondered what you would do if you found a lost child crying alone in the street? Would you stop even knowing that kindness is sometimes punished, that helping can be interpreted as a threat, that doing the right thing can cost you your reputation, your job, your peace? Would you choose humanity over self-preservation when the world has repeatedly taught you that getting involved only brings trouble? Sophie Chen faced exactly that choice on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. And the decision she made in seconds, a decision based purely on the instinct of not being able to ignore a child's suffering, would change her life in ways she could never have predicted. Because sometimes the simplest act of kindness becomes a catalyst for complete transformation. And sometimes, the person you save saves you back in ways you didn't know you needed to. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. Dead time in Ridgemont, a small town of 12,000 inhabitants, where everyone knew everyone in days. Followed a predictable rhythm. Sophie was closing pages in poetry, the independent bookstore she had managed for 8 years. Familiar routine. Turn off the lights from the back to the front. Check the cash register. Lock the back door. Prepare to leave through the main entrance. Thursdays were always quiet, midweek, tired people, few sales, and Sophie was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally, the kind that comes from living in a city where she never fully belonged, where she was always Sophie Chen, the Asian woman who manages the bookstore instead of just Sophie. She was grabbing her purse, keys in hand, when she heard it. A sound that made her stop completely. A sob. Small, muffled. Not the sob of an adult, trying to hide crying. The sob of a child, trying to be brave when the world was too frightening. Sophie turned, looked through the large shop window, and saw a little girl, standing on the sidewalk directly in front of the door. Alone. Completely alone on a street that was beginning to empty as shops closed for dinner. The girl was perhaps 5 years old, hard to say exactly, but small enough that being alone was obviously wrong. Blonde hair in braids that had been carefully done that morning, but were now messy, strands escaping, ribbons half undone. A bright yellow dress, the kind a mother chooses to make her daughter look sunny and happy, but now it had grass stains on the knees, and dirt on the hem as if she had fallen or been playing in a park. Small sneakers, with untied laces dragging on the concrete, and her face, God, her face was what broke Sophie's heart, cheeks red from crying. Big, frightened blue eyes, desperately searching in both directions of the street, searching for something, someone, the person who should have been there but wasn't. And her expression wasn't that of a child throwing a tantrum or being dramatic. It was genuine, contained despair. The kind of silent fear that comes from a child who has already learned very young that shouting doesn't necessarily bring help. That sometimes you're alone and you have to be brave, even when you don't feel brave. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever seen someone, especially a child, so visibly lost and frightened that they can't simply ignore it, even knowing that getting involved will complicate things? Sophie dropped her bag. She unlocked the door she had just locked, and she went out. Quickly, but not running, because she didn't want to scare the girl anymore. "Hi, dear," she said, gentle voice, crouching down to eye level. "Are you all right? Where are your parents?" Simple question, obvious, but the answer made the world tilt. The girl looked at Sophie with eyes that were too old for such a young face, and she said in a trembling voice, but trying to be strong, "I can't find Daddy. He was here. We were in the park. And then I looked, and he wasn't there anymore. And I walked and walked, but I don't know where to go. And I'm lost." The last word broke into a sob that she tried to contain but couldn't. And Sophie's heart, which she had carefully protected for years, which she had learned not to give too much of because people disappointed, tightened so tightly that it physically hurt. Because she knew that fear exactly, not theoretically, intimately. She was 7 years old, a large shopping mall 2 hours from Ridgemont. Her parents were working at the restaurant, so Grandma had taken her for a special outing, and Sophie had gotten distracted looking at toys. She turned down an aisle, then another, and suddenly Grandma was no longer there. and the world that had seemed safe and manageable became an impossible and terrifying labyrinth. It took 2 hours to find them. 2 hours of pure terror, where Sophie was sure she would never see her family again, that she was lost forever. And memory, visceral, intact even 25 years later, made it impossible to turn around and leave this little girl alone. So Sophie did the only thing she could. Knelt down completely. She got down to eye level. And she said with a conviction she didn't know she had, "It's okay. It's okay now. We'll find your daddy together. I promise. You're not alone anymore. Okay?" The girl looked at her, processing, deciding if she could trust her, and eventually nodded, small, hesitant, but accepting. "Okay, what's your name?" Sophie asked, gentle, establishing a connection. "Emma. Emma. What a beautiful name. My name is Sophie, and I'll take care of you until we find Daddy. Come with me. We'll give you water and figure out how to get you home." She took Emma's small hands, so small, so trusting despite her fear, and guided her into the bookstore. She turned the lights back on. She sat Emma in a comfortable chair near the children's section, and she picked up the phone to call the police, because a child was lost. Parents were probably desperately searching. Protocol was obvious. Stay with me until the end, because what Sophie didn't know, what she couldn't have known while dialing emergency numbers and trying to calm the frightened girl, was that a simple act of kindness was about to drag her into a situation that would test everything she believed about justice, about community, about trusting authority. She didn't know Emma's father wasn't just a desperate dad. He was the county sheriff working undercover on a dangerous investigation. She didn't know that the child had gotten lost because he'd made the mistake of leaving her alone while he checked for clues. She didn't know that when he showed up, relieved, grateful, but also trained to be suspicious, he would look at Sophie and wonder why exactly his child had ended up specifically in her shop, if it was a coincidence or something more sinister. And she definitely didn't know that the small town she called home, a town that already saw her as an outsider for being different, for being quiet, for not fitting in perfectly, would use her kindness as evidence of guilt. That helping would be interpreted as a threat. That doing the right thing would cost her reputation, her job, and almost her sanity. But she also didn't know that the man who came looking for his daughter would become the person who would finally see Sophie, really see her, and choose to protect her when the whole world seemed determined to destroy her. Sophie dialed 911, her hands trembling slightly. Not exactly from fear, but from the weight of responsibility she had just accepted. A child, lost, under her care until the parents were located. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. 911, what is your emergency? Hello, my name is Sophie Chen. I found a young girl, maybe 5 years old, lost in front of my store. She says she can't find her father. I need to report a missing child. Location, Pages and Poetry, bookstore at 247 Main Street, Ridgemont. Child's name, Emma. She hasn't given a last name yet. Okay, Miss Chen, keep the child with you. We'll send an officer immediately. They should arrive in 15 minutes. Thank you. Sophie hung up. She looked at Emma, who was sitting very quietly, very composed for a 5-year-old, hands folded in her lap. Eyes still red, but the tears had stopped. Just waiting. Trusting that an adult would take care of her. And Sophie felt such a strong wave of protection that it surprised her. She didn't have children. She wasn't particularly close to children in daily life. But something about Emma, her vulnerability, combined with bravery, touched something deep. The police are coming to get you, Sophie said gently. And they're going to help find your daddy. But while we wait, would you like some water? Or maybe a biscuit? Emma nodded. A biscuit, please. Polite even when scared. Well brought. Sophie went to the small kitchen in the back, where she kept basic supplies. She took a plastic cup, filled it with filtered water, and a packet of biscuits she had bought for the book club. Chocolate chip, always a hit with any age. She came back, handed it to Emma, and sat in a nearby chair. Not too close to be intrusive, but close enough for Emma to know she wasn't alone. So Emma, Sophie began. Conversational tone, trying to distract. Do you like stories? Emma nodded, mouth full of cookie. I love stories. What kind? Princesses and dragons, and it's stories about people being brave, even when they're scared. Specific, revealing. Those are better stories, Sophie agreed. Because being brave when you're not scared isn't really brave. It's just not being afraid, but being brave when you're scared. That's real courage. Emma processed that. Like me now. Exactly like you now. You're scared, but you're being so brave. Your daddy will be so proud. If something like this has ever happened to you, if you were ever that lost child, or an adult who stopped to help, even without knowing what would come next, share it in the comments. Because moments like these, where we choose kindness over convenience, are what define us. And Sophie, sitting in that bookstore, waiting for the police to arrive, while looking after a child she had met 10 minutes earlier, was defining herself in ways she didn't yet fully understand. 15 minutes turned into 20, then 25. Sophie checked her watch. She tried not to look anxious because Emma was watching. Children sense when adults are worried. Finally, at 40 minutes after the initial call, the bookstore door opened. An officer entered, dark blue uniform, badge gleaming. A man in his 40s, burly, with an expression that was not exactly friendly, more tired, bored, perhaps, as if a lost child were an inconvenience rather than an emergency. Sophie vaguely recognized him. Officer Jensen, she thought. She'd seen him around town, never interacted directly with him. Mrs. Chen, he said, not even looking at Emma first, looking at Sophie, assessing. Yes, thank you for coming. This is Emma. She was lost on the sidewalk. How exactly did you find her? Jensen interrupted, a tone that made Sophie pause. Not where she was or is she okay, but how did you find her? With an emphasis that implied, what, suspicion? I was closing the store, Sophie explained, keeping her voice neutral, even though her instinct told her something was wrong. I heard her crying. I went outside. She said she couldn't find her father, so I brought her inside and called you immediately. And how long was she here? Maybe 40 minutes since I called. And do you know this child? No, never seen her before, but I brought her inside the store. Instead of leaving her where she was or simply calling and waiting outside, a definitive accusation now, because I was scared and starting to get cold. And it seemed cruel to leave a 5-year-old child alone on the sidewalk when I could offer her safe space. If this part resonated with you, if you felt the injustice of Sophie being treated with suspicion when she literally did everything right, leave a like, so I know. Because stories like this, where kindness is punished instead of celebrated, need to be told. They need to be acknowledged, so that we can do better. And Sophie, standing in her own bookstore, being questioned as a suspect, instead of being thanked as a helper, was beginning to understand that she had crossed an invisible line. That in a world where fear outweighed trust, helping was a suspicious act. Especially when you were already seen as an outsider. Jensen asked more questions. Many, all with a tone that implied there was something sinister about Sophie helping. Where exactly was Emma when she found her? Why specifically in front of her shop? Was she sure she didn't know the child? Why didn't she wait outside instead of bringing her inside? Each question designed to make kindness seem like guilt. And Sophie answered them all, patiently, clearly, because what choice did she have? Finally, Jensen turned to Emma. Hi dear, are you okay? First time she recognized a child. I'm fine. Sophie took care of me. A small but significant defense. Jensen nodded. We'll take you and find your daddy. Okay. He took Emma's hand. And to Sophie, you need to be available for more questions. Don't leave town. As if she were suspected of a crime. As if helping were an offense. They left. Jensen with Emma, and Sophie was left alone in a bookstore that suddenly seemed very quiet, very empty. And she processed what had happened. She had Found a lost child. Called the authorities immediately. Cared for her until help arrived. Done everything right. And somehow, she was being treated as if she had done everything wrong. And worse, she knew what came next. Ridgemont was a small town. Gossip traveled at the speed of text messages, and a narrative was already being created. Sophie Chen had a child in a store. Police questioned her. There must be something suspicious. No facts, just insinuations. But in a small town, were as destructive as direct accusations. Sophie locked up the bookstore. Finally, 2 hours later than she had planned. She went up to the small apartment above the bakery where she lived, and sat in the dark, not turning on any lights, just sitting. And she wondered, not for the first time, not for the last, if kindness was worth the cost, if helping was worth being judged, if doing the right thing was worth the punishment that would inevitably come. And she had no answer, only profound weariness, and a growing fear that she had made a mistake, not in helping Emma, but in believing that the world would reward kindness instead of punishing her. If you want to follow the rest of this story, discover who Emma's father really is, how Sophie navigates the accusations that follow, and how an impossible connection forms between two people who should never have met, but who completely change each other's lives. Subscribe to the channel, because what comes next is a journey through injustice, redemption, and the kind of love that is built, not in moments, but on consistent choices of choosing person over protocol, humanity over fear. And Sophie was about to discover that the most unlikely Mantha sheriff, who had every reason to suspect her, would become the person who finally saw her and protected her, even when it cost her everything. Sophie's phone rang at 7 that night. It wasn't a number she recognized. She answered hesitantly. "Hello, Signoran Chen. It's Sarah Mitchell. My son is in the Wednesday book club. Or was. Pause. I heard what happened. About a lost child, and the police. And look, nothing personal, but I'll have to take Jason out of the club. I can't risk it." "Risk what?" Sophie asked, even though she already knew the answer. "Well, until everything is cleared up, I just need to be careful with my son." And she hung up. First casualty. It wouldn't be the last. Because in Ridgemont, reputation was everything. And Sophie had just lost hers. For being kind, for stopping to help, for choosing humanity. And she was about to discover that the price of kindness in a world that doesn't trust is almost higher than she can pay. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because to truly understand why that call from Sarah Mitchell, I'm going to have to remove Jason from the book club, devastated Sophie in ways that went far beyond losing a customer. You need to know the journey that led her to that moment. You need to understand that the bookstore wasn't just a job for her. It was a refuge. It was proof that she belonged somewhere, even when the whole world suggested otherwise. And that the identity she had carefully built over decades was about to be destroyed by an act of kindness that should have been celebrated, but would be used as evidence that she had always been the dangerous outsider the city suspected. Sophie Chen was 32 years old and had managed pages and poetry for 8 years, almost a third of her adult life. A small independent bookstore on Main Street in Ridgemont, a town of 12,000 inhabitants, nestled in a valley between the Appalachian Mountains. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where reputation was currency, where being different was tolerated but never fully accepted. Sophie wasn't a bookstore owner, just a manager. An important distinction because it meant she lived with the constant insecurity that her job could disappear if the store closed. An independent. Bookstores were dying all over the country. Amazon, eBooks, Barnes and Noble. The convenience of buying online at a discount instead of paying full price locally. Pages and poetry was barely surviving. Sales declining 5-7% each year. And Sophie knew that eventually, math wouldn't work anymore. But she loved the work in ways that were difficult to articulate to people who didn't understand. It wasn't just about selling books. It was about connecting people with the right stories at the right times. It was about a 40-year-old woman coming in looking for something to read during a difficult divorce, and Sophie handing her Educated by Tara Westover and seeing recognition in her eyes. It was about a shy teenager seeking escapism, and Sophie suggesting The Name of the Wind and seeing him return a week later, asking for a sequel, with excitement he hadn't shown about anything in months. It was about creating a space where stories mattered, where people could be seen. And the owner, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, 83, a retired literature professor who had opened the shop 40 years ago, trusted Sophie completely. "You have the soul of a storyteller, dear. Keep the shop alive." "I can't anymore." "But you can." And Sophie tried. Against increasingly impossible odds, she created a monthly book club that met last Wednesday. 15 regular members discussed everything from literary fiction to thrillers. She started Storytime for Children on Saturdays at 10. Sophie read in different voices, brought characters to life, and children laughed, and parents thanked her for an hour of free educational entertainment. She organized poetry nights on Fridays every other week, where local poets could share their work and the community could gather around art. Small things, but significant. They kept doors open. Barely. Sophie had grown up in Ridgemont, not by choice, but by circumstance. Daughter of Wei and Lin Chunchne's immigrants, who had arrived in the United States when Sophie was 3 years old. Her parents had left Guangdong with meager life savings and enormous dreams. They opened Golden Dragon, a small Chinese restaurant on the edge of Ridgemont, the only Chinese restaurant within 50 kilometers. And they worked tirelessly, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. No vacations, no days off. Building a life, dollar by dollar. They sent money to family in China Wei's aging parents, Lin's sick sister. They religiously saved for Sophie's education, because education was the path to a better life. You don't work in a restaurant, Mother would say. You go to college. You get a good job. You don't break your back like we did. And Sophie had been a good student. Not brilliant, but consistently good, quiet, obedient. The kind of stereotypical Asian daughter that teachers loved because she didn't cause trouble. She sat in the front, she did her homework. She got A's and B's, and she was lonely, not by choice, but because being different in Ridgemont, the only Asian child in a class of 25 meant always being slightly out of place. Invitations to birthday parties came, but not always. Sleepovers happened, but Sophie was often forgotten. Not maliciously, just forgotten, as if she didn't fully belong to the social circle that other children naturally inhabited. So books became friends, a refuge, a place where she completely belonged, because in stories, being different was often a virtue. Heroines were outsiders. They were quiet until they needed to be brave. They were underestimated until they proved their worth. And Sophie devoured stories. Fantasy, mostly. Worlds where being different was magical instead of a flaw. She went to East Tennessee State University, 2 hours from Ridgemont, far enough to be independent, close enough to visit her parents regularly. She studied English literature because she loved it, not because it was practical. And her parents, who had expected medicine or engineering, or at least business, supported her, even though they were worried. "If it makes you happy, we'll make it work," her father said. "But Sophie, literature doesn't pay the bills." "I know, Baba, but it makes me happy, and I'll find a way to make it work." And she tried. She graduated at 22 with a degree in English literature and absolutely no idea what to do with it. Big cities, Nashville, Atlanta, Charlotte were options, but they were overwhelming. Too much noise, too much movement, too much competition. And Sophie wasn't a natural competitor. She was an observer, a thinker, a person who processed the world internally rather than externally. So she returned to Ridgemont, not triumphant, but not defeated either, just returning. She worked at her parents' restaurant for a year, hostess, occasional waitress, helped with accounting because she was good with numbers, even though her passion was words. And she looked for work that required a degree. Difficult in a small town. Librarian. Only one position, and it was filled by a woman who had been there for 20 years. Teacher, required certification she didn't have. And then Mrs. Whitmore posted an ad. Bookstore manager wanted. Love of books essential. Experience preferred, but will train right person. Sophie applied immediately. The interview was more conversation than formal questioning. Why books, dear? Because stories are how we understand the world, how we see ourselves and others, how we learn empathy and courage, and that we are not alone. You understand, Mrs. Whitmore said. Not a question, a statement. The job is yours. And Sophie had found purpose. It wasn't a glamorous job. It paid $42,000 a year, enough to live modestly in Ridgemont, where the cost of living was low but not enough to save much. It paid rent on a small apartment. It bought groceries. It helped parents occasionally when the restaurant had a bad month. And that was all. No significant savings. No robust retirement plan. No real financial security. But it was meaningful. It helped the community. It connected people with stories they needed. And stories mattered. They had literally saved Sophie countless times when she was a lonely child, trying to understand why she didn't fit in. When she was a teenager navigating her identity in a city that saw her as perpetually an outsider, even though she was born in Tennessee. When she was a young adult trying to figure out what kind of life she wanted, when family, expectations and economic reality didn't align. Sophie lived alone in a small apartment above Sweet Rise Bakery on Main Street. 1 bedroom, tiny kitchen, a living room that was basically just a sofa and a bookcase, but it was hers. Space she controlled, decorated with an eclectic taste, posters of favorite book covers, plants she miraculously kept alive, a crocheted blanket her grandmother in China had made years ago. She hadn't had a serious relationship. Never had, really. A few dates over the years. Jake in college, which lasted 3 months before they realized they had nothing in common besides American literature class. Michael, 2 years ago, who worked at a bank and had been kind but boring and had ended things by saying, "You're great, Sophie. I just think we want different things." And she hadn't argued because it was true. Partly because Ridgemont had an extremely limited pool of singles. Men in their 30s were usually married or divorced with complicated baggage. Partly because Sophie was cautious, guarded, didn't trust easily, didn't open up quickly. Years of being seen as different, Asian in a predominantly white city, quiet in a culture that valued extroversion and social charm, interested in books and art in a community that valued practicality and manual labor, had taught her to build walls, to protect her heart because opening it meant risking rejection, a risk she had already experienced enough times to last a lifetime. So she lived a quiet life, predictable, safe, but also lonely, working Monday to Saturday at the bookstore, Sundays visiting her parents at the restaurant, helping with prep work, or simply sitting with them during the quiet hour before dinner. Occasional walks alone on mountain trails around Ridgemont, where she could think without interruption, where silence was companionable instead of oppressive. And the bookstore was her world, the only space where she felt completely competent, where she knew what she was doing, where she made a small but real difference, where she was seen not as Sophie Chen, the Asian girl, but as Sophie, who always has the perfect recommendation. Late Thursday morning, a lost child turned up, and Sophie made a choice, an instinctive one, based on basic humanity, to stop and help. And that choice, that simple decision not to ignore a child's suffering, changed everything. Because it revealed a truth Sophie had tried to ignore for years, that no matter how long she lived in Ridgemont, how much she contributed, how much she tried to belong, she would always be an outsider. She would always be suspect, and kindness wasn't seen as a virtue. It was seen as evidence of an ulterior motive. Because people who don't belong can't do good things without a hidden agenda. And Sophie was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the failure Sophie experienced wasn't just an isolated misunderstanding or an overreaction from a single officer. It was systemic betrayal by an entire community that should have recognized goodness, but chose suspicion instead. It was a devastating revelation that years of trying to belong, to contribute, to be a part of Ridgemont, hadn't built a foundation of trust. They had only created an illusion of acceptance that evaporated the moment it was truly tested. And the impact wasn't just on reputation or work. It was on fundamental identity, on who Sophie thought she was, and what place she thought she had in the world. The hours following that first call, Sarah Mitchell, withdrawing her son from the book club, were a masterclass in how reputations are destroyed in a small town. Not dramatically, not with a single, clear public accusation, but through 1,000 small cuts. Text messages that came in waves. Calls that began with, "I heard something worrying." Silences that were louder than words. Friday morning, Sophie woke to 3 new messages. The first from a different book club member. "Hi Sophie, unfortunately I won't be able to make the meeting next Wednesday. Scheduling conflict." An identical message from 2 other members. 3 simultaneous cancellations from a group of 15 wasn't a coincidence. It was coordination. People had talked, decided together that associating with Sophie was risky now. The second message was from a father who brought 7-year-old twins to story time. "Just a heads up that we won't be able to do it on Saturday. The kids love it, but there are some concerns being raised and I need to prioritize their safety, security." As if Sophie, who had literally saved a child and immediately contacted authorities, was a threat. The third message was worse. From the organizer of the annual Ridgemont Book Festival, where Sophie had volunteered for 5 years. "Sophie, we've received feedback from some vendors concerned about your participation this year given the recent incident. Nothing personal. We just want to avoid controversy. Perhaps it's best if you skip this year." Incident. As if helping Emma was a scandal instead of an act of basic human decency. Sophie went to work anyway. Why else would she? Staying home would seem like an admission of guilt. So she opened the bookstore at 9 as usual, and waited for customers who normally came on Friday mornings. Mrs. Patterson, who bought a new mystery every week, didn't show up. Mr. Reynolds, who browsed the history section by the hour before choosing something, didn't show up. Young mother with baby in stroller, who always stopped during her morning walk, didn't show up. At 11, the only person who had entered was a teenager looking for the bathroom. "Isn't this for customers?" he asked, when Sophie pointed to a sign. "You need to buy something first." He left. And Sophie sat behind the cash register counter in the empty store and felt the weight of isolation that was different from usual. Loneliness. Because loneliness, she knew. She had lived with it for years. But this was active rejection. It was the community saying collectively, "You don't belong. You never belonged. And we don't want you here." Lunchtime, she went to Rosie's diner 2 doors down as she did every Friday. Usual order: turkey sandwich, iced tea. She sat at the counter, and she noticed conversations stopped when she entered. Not all of them, but enough that it was noticeable. Furtive glances, whispers, and when Rosie, the 60-something owner who had always been friendly, brought the order, she didn't make the usual conversation. She just put the plate down. $12, cold tone. And Sophie understood. Even Rosie had heard, had judged, had decided that distance was safer than association. She ate quickly, paid, left, and walking back to the bookstore, she passed a group of 3 women mothers she recognized from story time. One made eye contact. Sophie smiled. Small, an attempt at normalcy. The woman deliberately looked away, turned her body slightly, signaled to her friends, and the trio crossed the street to avoid passing directly by Sophie. Rejection so obvious it physically hurt. And Sophie realized, it wasn't just about Emma, it was about everything that came before. Years of being different had created a foundation of distrust that was always there, just dormant. And the incident with Emma had awakened it, given permission for people to express suspicions they had always felt, but never articulated. I always thought she was strange. A woman in her 30s, without a family of her own, focusing so much on children. It always seemed odd. And she's so quiet. You never know what she's thinking. Narratives that Sophie imagined being constructed in conversations she couldn't hear but could feel. Saturday was supposed to be a big day story time at 10, then a steady stream of families browsing. Sophie prepared as always. She selected books. She organized a reading area with cushions and stuffed animals. She made promotional posters, and she waited. 10 o'clock arrived. No one came. 10:15. Nothing. 10:30. Finally, the door opened. Sophie felt relieved. But it was just a 60-year-old man looking for a specific book about Civil War history. Not interested in storytelling. He bought a book. He left. 11 o'clock. Sophie accepted reality. No one was coming. Parents had collectively decided that Sophie was persona non grata, that children were not safe around her. Based on what? On nothing but official suspicions and town gossip. But facts didn't matter. Perception was reality. And perception was that Sophie had done something wrong, even though literally all she did was help a lost child. On Sunday, she went to visit her parents as usual. Golden Dragon was closed on Sundays, their only day off. Her parents were in the kitchen of the small apartment above the restaurant where Sophie had grown up. Her mother was cooking. Her father was reading the newspaper. The normalcy Sophie desperately needed. "Hi Mama, Baba," she said, entering and hugging them both. "Sophie," her mother said, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sit down, eat, always food." A mother's love language. They sat down, they ate. And then her father said what Sophie had been fearing. "We heard something about you and the lost child." And the police. Of course they had heard. Because gossip reached everyone. "It's not what it seems," Sophie began. "I found the lost girl. I helped. I called the police. I did everything right. But people talk," her father said. "Not accusations, concern. They say things. And the restaurant. We already have fewer customers this year. If people associate us with trouble, it could hurt business." And Sophie understood. Even her parents were worried. Not that she had done anything wrong, but that being associated with her could cost them. "Do you want me to stay away?" Sophie asked, trying to keep her voice neutral, failing. "No," her mother said quickly. "Of course not, but maybe. For now, be careful. Don't come to the restaurant when it's full. Just until things calm down." Gentle rejection, but rejection nonetheless, from her own parents. And Sophie knew it wasn't because they didn't love her. It was because they were immigrants who had built a life through impossible work and couldn't risk losing everything by associating with a daughter who had somehow become an outcast. "I understand," Sophie said. "I'll be careful." She finished her meal quickly. She left and drove back to her apartment, feeling an isolation more complete than anything she had ever experienced before. Monday, Mrs. Whitmore showed up at the bookstore. Unusual because she rarely came. Health was failing, mobility limited, but she came. And her expression said it all before she even opened her mouth. "Sophie dear, we need to talk." A stomach-churning tone. They sat in a small back office. "I got a call," Mrs. Whitmore began, her hands trembling slightly edge or nervousness. "From City Councilor Tom Bradley. He said that concerns have been raised about the safety of having children's events here, given the recent incident with a lost child and the police. An incident where I literally saved a child and called the authorities." Sophie couldn't hide the bitterness in her voice. "I know, dear. I know you did the right thing. But perception is complicated." And Bradley mentioned that several parents contacted the council, concerned. And there's pressure to suspend children's events, temporarily, and sales. Sophie asked, already knowing. Down 30% on weekends. And the book club. 8 people canceled for Wednesday. More than half. Sophie, the store was already struggling financially. Amazon, ebooks, margins are impossible. If we lose children's events, our biggest traffic generator, and if the community really boycotts us, I don't know if we'll survive. Painful. Pause. Tears in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes. They're suggesting you maybe take time off. Temporary leave. Just until things calm down. Until the truth comes out and people realize they misjudged. You're firing me, Sophie said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact. Not firing. Leave. With partial pay. 20 hours a week instead of 40. And as soon as possible, I'll bring you back full-time. And if that's not possible, if the narrative never changes, silence. The answer was obvious. Mrs. Whitmore would choose business over employee. She had to choose. It was a survival decision, not a personal one. But it hurt nonetheless. How long? Sophie asked. 2 weeks initially. Then we'll reassess. Okay, Sophie said. Because what else could she say? Fighting would mean forcing Mrs. Whitmore to choose between her and the store. And Sophie wasn't going to make the 83-year-old suffer anymore. Thank you for understanding, dear, Mrs. Whitmore said. And she left, leaving Sophie alone in an office that suddenly seemed very small, very suffocating. And she realized she had lost more than hours of work. She had lost her identity. Because who was she without a bookstore? Without work that defined her days? Without a purpose that gave meaning to her existence? She didn't know. And the terror of that uncertainty was worse than anything. That night, she went to the market to buy groceries because the refrigerator was empty. Simple, mundane, except it wasn't. Because, in the dairy aisle, she saw Jennifer Morrison, a mother who had brought twins to story time for 2 years. Sophie smiled. She waved, and Jennifer looked directly at her. Her expression hardened, and she did something Sophie would never forget. She grabbed her 5-year-old son's hand and pulled him back, physically, as if Sophie were a danger, as if proximity were a threat. And she whispered something to her son that Sophie didn't hear but could imagine. Stay away from her, or don't talk to her, or she's a bad person. And something broke inside Sophie. Not dramatically, not with tears or a public meltdown, but silently, internally. The acceptance that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, she would never be fully accepted. She would always be an outsider. She would always be suspect. And kindness, the most basic act of humanity, had been used as the final proof that she didn't belong. That she never belonged, and never would. She paid for groceries, driven home, climbed the stairs to her apartment, locked the door, and sat in the dark, not crying, just empty, processing a truth she had tried to deny for 32 years, that Ridgemont had never been home. It had only been a place where she existed, and difference mattered, because home was where she belonged, and she didn't belong anywhere. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because the moment Ethan Cole truly began to pay attention, not just to the fact that Emma had been found, but to who had found her and how she was being treated, wasn't when he saw his daughter safe at the station. It was when he processed Jensen's tone, the suspicion, the insinuation, and recognized a pattern he'd seen dozens of times in 15 years as a law enforcement officer. Good people being punished for doing the right thing because they didn't fit expectations of what goodness should look like. And the decision he made at that moment, not just to thank Sophie, but to actively intervene against the injustice being perpetrated against her, was the first sign of awareness that would change the trajectory of both their lives. Sheriff Ethan Cole wasn't supposed to be in Ridgemont that Thursday. His schedule had him in his office in the county capital, Mount Pleasant, 20 miles north, processing a mountain of case paperwork that had consumed the last 3 months. A drug trafficking operation that had started as a small routine traffic stop, revealing a suspicious amount of money, had expanded into a network spanning 3 counties. 15 arrests eventually, significant seizures, and endless paperwork that came with successful investigations, reports, testimony, coordination with the prosecutor. The kind of tedious but necessary work that kept criminals locked up. But at 4:15, the phone rang. A number he recognized: Marcus Webb, an informant who had been invaluable in dozens of cases over the years. A former addict turned valuable eyes and ears in communities that didn't trust police. Ethan, it's Marcus. I have something you'll want to know. I'm listening. Suspicious activity near Ridgemont. Abandoned warehouse on River Road. I saw 2 black SUVs go in this morning. They stayed for an hour. They left quickly. And one of the drivers, I recognized him from your investigation. Tony Brescia, an associate of Mike Torrance, whom you arrested last month. Ethan became alert. Tony Brescia was a fish that had escaped the net. Insufficient evidence for charges, but certainty of involvement. Are you sure? Absolutely. Memory for faces. Remember. And activity. It wasn't social. It was business. I think they might be using the warehouse as a backup distribution point, now that primary locations have been compromised. Good work, Marcus. I'll check it out. Be careful. These guys don't mess around. I never am. A lie, but reassuring. Ethan hung up, and he had a choice. Send a local officer to check, or go personally. Ridgemont's department was officers covering the city and surrounding rural areas, and Ethan didn't know any of them well. Trusting a stranger with a sensitive investigation, risky. So she decided she would go herself. But there was a complication. It was Thursday, his day with Emma. The post-divorce custody agreement had been brutal. Rachel, his ex-wife, had fought for full custody, claiming that Ethan's job as sheriff was incompatible with responsible fatherhood. You put your badge above family. You always do. And I'm not going to let our daughter grow up feeling like she's second priority. And the judge had not completely agreed, but he had been influenced. Shared custody, but with a warning to Ethan. Mr. Cole, if there is future evidence that work is interfering with parental time, I will review the agreement. Understood? Understood. So Ethan had been religiously careful. Alternate Thursdays and weekends were sacred. No work, no calls, just Emma. But today he had an opportunity to advance the investigation. And if he didn't check, the lead would go cold. Brescia would disappear. And the case he had invested months building would have a hole. An impossible choice between being a good father and a good sheriff. Not for the first time, not for the last, but always impossible. He decided he would take Emma. Not ideal. Definitely not recommended by protocol or common sense, but it would be quick. Drive to Ridgemont. 15 minutes to check the warehouse from a safe distance. Take photos. To see if there was activity. Return. Emma would never need to know it was work-related. Just adventure with Daddy. Emma, darling, he said, as he picked her up from Rachel's house at 3. We have a special adventure today. We're going to drive, explore a new town. Maybe stop for ice cream on the way back. Emma, 5 years old, her blonde hair in braids. Rachel had done that morning. Her favorite yellow dress brightened adventure. Can I bring my tablet? Sure, but only if you promise to. Look out the window too. The scenery is beautiful. I promise. Energetic, confident. The kind of child who trusted Daddy always kept her safe, and Ethan was going to keep that promise. He had to. They drove to Ridgemont. 25 minutes. Emma chattered about school, friends, the new book she was reading. And Ethan listened, really listened, because those moments were precious. They were why he did everything. They arrived at 3:40. Ethan cruised to River Road. Warehouse was in an abandoned industrial district. 3 large, empty buildings that had been a textile factory decades ago, before work went overseas. Now just decaying structures, surrounded by cracked parking lots and weeds growing through the concrete. Perfect for illicit activity, because nobody came here. Ethan parked 2 blocks away. Far enough away not to be obvious. Close enough to observe. Emma, Daddy needs to check something quickly. You stay in the car. Okay. Doors locked. Tablet on. 5 minutes, maximum. Why? Can't I go? Because it's boring adult stuff. And you'll be happier here, watching videos. Logic a 5-year-old would accept. Okay, but come back quickly, I promise. Ethan locked the doors. He activated the child lock so Emma couldn't open them from the inside. And he went. Quickly. Disguised jeans, t-shirt, baseball cap pulled down low. No uniform, no visible badge. Just a guy walking. He approached the warehouse. No SUV now, but signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks on the dusty concrete. Discarded packaging near the back door, the kind used for drugs. And the door was ajar. Not forced open, but not properly locked. Ethan checked around. Nobody. He went in. The warehouse was large, dark. It smelled of mold and something chemical. He used his phone flashlight, and he saw an improvised table, scales, residues of white powder that was probably cocaine or fentanyl. The operation was active, or had been very recently. He took photos, he documented it, and he realized it had taken 12 minutes, not 5. Emma would be impatient. He left quickly. He walked back to the car, and his heart stopped. The passenger door was open. Tablet on the seat. Emma. She wasn't there. EMM. He shouted loudly, not caring about discretion now. EMM. Where are you? Silence. Panic that Ethan hadn't felt in years, not since Rachel had called, saying Emma had fallen off her bike and broken her arm hit him. Complete, overwhelming. He searched around the car. Nothing. He checked. Underneath. Behind. Nothing. EMA again. More desperate now. And he realized she had left. Child lock probably malfunctioning. Or Emma had figured out how to disable it. She was smart, always solving things, and she had left. Maybe bored. Maybe she saw something interesting. And now she was lost in a city they didn't know, in an area that wasn't safe. And it was completely his fault. He had chosen to work on her safety. He had brought his daughter into the active investigation. And now he had lost her. Ethan searched, systematically, forcing panic to the back burner, because panic didn't find children. Training kicked in. He checked the area around the warehouse. First, maybe she had followed him. Nothing. He expanded the search. Nearby residential blocks, shouting names, asking anyone he saw. Little girl, 5 years old, blonde hair in braids, yellow dress. Did you see her? Most shook their heads. One woman said, I saw a child walking alone toward the park, maybe 20 minutes ago. I thought it was strange, but park? Direction. Ethan ran. The municipal park was 5 blocks away. He arrived. He searched. The playground had a dozen children. No Emma. He checked the restrooms. Nothing. Picnic area. Nothing. And terror escalated, because every passing minute was a minute where something could happen, where a lost child could be caught by a predator, or run over by a car, or simply disappear into an unknown city and never be found. Hours. Ethan searched for hours. Eventually, he called the department. I need assistance. My daughter is missing in Ridgemont. Emma Cole, 5 years old. He gave a description, and the officer on duty said, We're sending units. Sheriff. We'll find her. But the tone had a sympathy that made Ethan realize everyone knew he had lost his daughter. That the sheriff, the person supposed to protect the community, had failed to protect his own daughter. A failure that would be judged, remembered, used against him. Finally, at 6:22 hours, and 40 minutes after discovering Emma was missing, the phone rang. Department Sheriff Cole. Good news. Emma has been found. Safe. Officer Jensen picked her up from the civilian who found her. Emma is at the station now. Not injured. Relief so intense his knees almost buckled. I'm coming. 5 minutes. He drove to the station, a small brick building in the center of Ridgemont. He went inside and saw Emma sitting in a chair, cookies in hand, looking scared but unharmed. He ran to her. Emma, my God, are you okay? Are you hurt? He knelt down. He checked her arms, legs, face, searching for injuries. I'm okay, Daddy, Emma said, small voice, knowing she had done something wrong. I just got lost. but a nice woman found me. At the bookstore, she gave me cookies and water and said she would help me find you." "Which woman?" Ethan asked. Gratitude crushing anger. "Sophie. She owns a bookstore with lots of books, and she was kind." And Ethan realized someone had saved his daughter. A stranger had seen a lost child and had stopped and helped when it would have been easier to ignore it, and he needed to thank her immediately. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the event that truly connected Ethan and Sophie, that transformed a moment of gratitude into the beginning of something far more meaningful, wasn't just the conversation that first night. It was Ethan's conscious decision not only to thank her and leave, but to actively intervene against the injustice being perpetrated. It was the moment he chose to use his authority, not to investigate Sophie, but to protect her. And it was Sophie's gradual recognition that the man sitting in her apartment, the sheriff who had every reason to suspect her, given the strange circumstances, was choosing to see her as a person, rather than a case. And that choice, that decision of humanity over protocol, planted a seed of trust that would grow into something neither of them expected. Ethan showed up at Sophie's apartment at 7:30 that evening. He hadn't planned on arriving so late. He'd planned to wait until morning, call, and schedule an appropriate meeting in a professional context. But after picking Emma up from the station, after hugging her and checking on her, and eventually leaving her with Dave Morrison, a veteran officer and friend who had 3 children of his own and who didn't ask questions when Ethan said, "I need to do something." 30 minutes tops, he couldn't wait. He needed to see Sophie Chen. Not just to thank her, but to understand. Because something about the whole situation bothered him. Jensen treating Sophie with suspicion. Emma specifically showing up in front of her shop, and the way Jensen had described it, acting defensively, as if Sophie having boundaries and questioning were evidence of guilt instead of a normal reaction to be treated as criminal when she performed an act of kindness. So he went. He got the file address, Sophie Chen, apartment to be above Sweet Rice Bakery, Main Street. He drove there. The small town was quiet at night, shops closed, streets empty except for a few cars parked outside a local bar. He found the bakery easily. Old building, but well maintained. External stairs to the side, leading to the apartments above. He went up, wood creaking under his boots, and he stopped in front of the door, marked to be. He knocked. Not too hard. He didn't want to scare her. He waited. He heard light footsteps, hesitant, and the door opened, but only the security chain, 2 inches opening. Brown eyes looking through, cautious, assessing the threat. Yes, the voice was controlled, but Ethan could hear the tension. A woman expecting trouble. "Mrs. Chen, Sophie Chen." "Yes. Who are you?" His tone was definitely defensive now, preparing to close the door if necessary. "My name is Ethan Cole. I'm Emma's father. The girl you helped today." Instant change. Sophie's expression shifted from caution to surprise, shoulders relaxed slightly. "Emma," she repeated. "Is she all right?" First concern not about why Ethan was there, but about the child. Revealing she is completely fine, thanks to you. Ethan paused. "May I come in? I want to thank you properly, and also apologize." "Apologize for what?" Genuine confusion. "For Officer Jensen, for the way he treated you. I heard you were questioned with suspicion when you should have been thanked," and something passed across Sophie's face. Recognition. That Ethan knew, that he had heard, and that he was there not only to thank her, but to acknowledge injustice. Sophie studied him for a moment. Really studied him. Tall man, maybe 6'2", probably late 30s. Dark brown hair that was slightly tousled, as if he'd run his fingers through it repeatedly. Eyes that were intense, not threatening, but the kind of intensity that came from someone paying attention, processing everything. Casual closed jeans, blue button-down shirt, jacket, but his posture screamed authority, even without a uniform. His way of standing. His way of making direct eye contact. This was a man accustomed to commanding situations, but his tone was gentle, respectful, asking permission rather than demanding entry. "You're a police officer too," Sophie said. "Not a question. A statement based on observation. Sheriff, county sheriff, but not in an official capacity today. Just being a father who made a serious mistake and almost cost everything." Vulnerability in the admission that surprised Sophie. Law enforcement officers, in her experience, didn't admit mistakes, not to civilians, not voluntarily. She released the chain, opened the door completely. "Come in." Stepping back to allow passage, Ethan entered, and immediately noticed the apartment was small, basically a studio with a separate bedroom, but it was cozy, a word that came to mind. Books everywhere, not clutter, but presence. Bookshelves covering every available wall, double, triple shelves in some places. Organized by he looked closer, not alphabetically, but thematically perhaps, or by color in some sections. Piles on the coffee table. Dozens of bookmarks sticking out, indicating books in progress. A sofa that was clearly worn, but had a soft blanket thrown over the arm and matching cushions. A tiny kitchen, visible through a crack, clean, organized herbs growing on the windowsill. And a smell of books, coffee, something floral he couldn't identify. Space that was clearly hers, not decorated to impress, but created to live in. "Sorry about the mess," Sophie said. An automatic gesture of hospitality, even though there was no real mess. "It's not a mess," Ethan said. "It's lived in a good way." He sat down when Sophie indicated the sofa. She took the chair opposite, maintaining an appropriate distance. Still cautious, even though she had allowed entry. "I want to explain what happened," Ethan began. "Why Emma was lost. And why I'm so grateful, more grateful than you probably realize that you found her." And he told the story. The whole story. Not an edited version, but the complete truth. About a narcotics investigation that had consumed 3 months. About Marcus's lead on activity in Richmond. About the decision to go check it out personally because he didn't know local officials well enough to trust with a sensitive investigation. And it was my day with Emma. Custody agreement. And my ex-wife had been clear. Wasting time with Emma for work would give her ammunition to fight for full custody. So I brought Emma. I thought it would be quick. 15 minutes at most. But it took 12 minutes to check the warehouse. And when I got back to the car, Emma wasn't there. Door open, tablet on the seat, and she, gone. Ethan's voice broke slightly. I spent the worst 3 hours of my life searching, shouting her name, checking every street, every store, thinking about everything that could have happened. A predator, taking her, a car running her over, her simply disappearing and never being found. And it was completely my fault. I had chosen work over her safety. I had brought my daughter into a potentially dangerous situation, and I had lost her. Pause, deep breath, and then I got a call. Jensen saying Emma had been found. By you. That you had kept her safe. Called the police immediately. Done everything right. And the relief was overwhelming, but also gratitude. Because you didn't have to help it. Would have been easier to ignore it, or call from a distance. But you got involved. Brought Emma inside. Took care of her. And saved not only her, but saved me from living in horror of having lost my daughter because of my own stupidity. Anyone would have done it, Sophie said, automatically downplaying it, uncomfortable with praise. No, Ethan said firmly. Anyone wouldn't have. Many people would have ignored it, or called and waited outside without getting involved. Fear of responsibility. Fear of complication. Fear of being blamed if something went wrong. But you got involved. You brought a frightened child to a safe space. You offered comfort. You kept calm until help arrived. And that matters. More than you realize. Sophie didn't know what to say. Then she spoke a deeper truth. She was scared. Lost. And I know that feeling exactly, of being lost. Of the world being too big and you too small and no one coming. So I did what I wish someone had done for me. Her own vulnerability. An exchange of honesty that Ethan recognized and appreciated. "Have you ever been lost?" he asked gently. Not a question, genuine curiosity, metaphorically. "Many times," Sophie admitted, a half-sad smile, literally. "Once, I was 7. My grandma took me to a big mall, 2 hours away. And I got distracted looking at toys. I turned down an aisle, then another. And suddenly she wasn't there anymore. And the world that had seemed safe became terrifying. 2 hours, until they found me. 2 hours of pure terror, where I was sure I would never see my family again. And I still remember vividly how every adult who passed seemed gigantic and indifferent. How nobody really saw me. Just a little Asian child crying, that wasn't their problem. Then when I saw Emma, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Ethan understood completely. "Thank you," he said. A simple word, but laden with meaning in his voice. "For seeing her. For stopping when it would have been easier to continue. For caring when you weren't obligated to care. For being the kind of person the world needs more of." And in that moment, something passed between them. Not romantic, not yet. Too soon, too fresh a situation. But recognition. A connection between two people who instinctively understood that doing the right thing often costs something. That kindness wasn't always easy or safe, but that it was worth the cost. And that there were other people in the world who operated by the same moral code. Even when it was inconvenient. "There's another reason I came," Ethan admitted after a moment. "A more complicated reason." Sophie waited. "Jensen mentioned when I picked up Emma that you were questioned with suspicion. That he treated the situation as if you potentially had done something wrong. And I imagine based on how small towns work, and Ridgemont is no exception, that gossip has already started. That a narrative is being built that doesn't reflect reality." Sophie nodded slowly. 3 calls so far. 1 from a casual friend asking if I had trouble with the police. 1 from a book club member saying she heard I was being investigated for something involving a minor. And a third worst from a mother who brings children to story time saying she'll have to stop bringing them until this is cleared up. As if I did something that requires clarification. Bitterness in her voice that she didn't try to hide. Anger shot across Ethan's face. Genuine, visible. "This is unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. You helped a lost child. You literally did everything right. And you're being punished for it because a lazy officer did a bad job and because people assume worse." "It's Ridgemont," Sophie said, shrugging as if resigned. "People talk. They invent narratives that fill in the gaps with the worst possible scenario. Especially about people they already see as different." "Different how?" Ethan asked, though he suspected something. "Asian in a predominantly white city. Single at 32, with no family of her own. Quiet, keeps to herself, works with books instead of anything real. Picks the whole list. No self-pity, just a statement of fact. And so you're saying this isn't the first time you've been unfairly judged?" "That's life," Sophie said. "You learn to live with it." "You shouldn't have to live with it," Ethan said, looking directly into her eyes. "And not when I can do something about it. I'm going to make a statement, official, as county sheriff, explaining exactly what happened. That Emma got lost because of my mistake. My failure as a father to bring her into the work situation and not supervise her properly. That you found her and helped her without hesitation. That any insinuation of impropriety is completely baseless and ridiculous. And I'm going to make sure this city knows." Posted on the department website. Shared in local groups. Impossible to ignore. "You don't have to do this," Sophie said. But Tom had hope, a desire to believe. "Yes, I do," Ethan said. "Because it's right, and because I won't allow the person who saved my daughter to be punished for kindness. But also," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Also because something tells me you've had people assume worse of you. Making judgments based on appearance or difference instead of character or actions. And I won't add to that. And I won't stand by while others do. and Sophie, a woman who had learned through 32 years of experience not to expect kindness from strangers, especially from authority figures who were often the first to judge, realize something fundamental. Ethan Cole was different. He saw her. He truly saw her. Not a category or stereotype, but a person. And he was actively choosing to use his position of power to protect instead of investigate, to uplift instead of suspect, and that changed everything. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the escalation of danger Sophie experienced in the days following that first conversation with Ethan wasn't gradual or predictable. It was sudden. It was a devastating revelation that helping Emma hadn't just cost her reputation, it had put her on the radar of people far more dangerous than small-town gossips. And it was the moment she realized that the isolation she had chosen for years as protection now made her vulnerable in ways she had never anticipated. Because when you're alone, without a support network, without family to turn to, without a community that believes in you, you become an easy target. And Sophie was about to discover that the hidden truth behind Ethan's investigation was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Ethan's statement helped. He posted it Friday morning, an official statement on the county department's website. Clear, unambiguous language. On March 14th, my 5-year-old daughter, Emma Cole, was temporarily lost in Ridgemont due to a lapse in supervision on my part. Sophie Chen, manager of Pages and Poetry, found Emma, provided immediate and appropriate care, and contacted authorities without delay. Ms. Chen's actions were exemplary and deserve recognition, not suspicion. Any insinuation of inappropriate behavior is completely unfounded. I personally thank Ms. Chen for ensuring my daughter's safety. Signed, Sheriff Ethan Cole, County Sheriff. And he shared it in local Facebook groups. He posted it on the city's page. He made sure it was impossible to ignore, and it helped. Gossip subsided. Didn't stop because Ridgemont had a long memory, and people always looked for drama, but it reduced to murmuring instead of roaring. Sophie received 2 calls from people apologizing, sorry for assuming worse. The sheriff's statement made that clear, not complete acceptance, but recognition that they had misjudged. Sophie tried to get back to normal. She opened the bookstore. She worked. She hoped time would heal the rest. But Saturday, 2 days after the statement, something happened that made the situation much more serious and much more complicated. Mrs. Whitmore showed up at the bookstore. Unusual because she rarely came anymore at 3 years old, failing health, limited mobility. But she came, and the expression on her face wasn't the usual grandmotherly sweetness. It was concern, deep concern. "Sophie dear, we need to talk," she said, a tone that made Sophie's stomach sink immediately. They sat in a small back office, a cramped space with a desk piled high with invoices and inventory. Mrs. Whitmore closed the door, a sign of seriousness. "I got a call this morning," she began. Her hands trembled slightly. "From Tom Bradley, city councilor. He said that concerns were raised at the council about safety in continuing to have children's events here at the store, given a recent incident. An incident where I literally saved a lost child and called the police." Sophie couldn't quite keep the bitterness from her voice. "I know, dear. I know. And I told Tom exactly that, said it's absurd, that you did everything right, that the sheriff's statement makes that clear. But he said there's pressure from parents, from community members, and the council is concerned about liability." Liability for what? If something happened, if a child was hurt during an event here, and there were questions about you, then the store could be held liable. "But there are no questions about me," Sophie protested. "Sheriff made that clear, I know. But perception still exists, and the store is already struggling financially. Sophie, you know that. Sales are falling. Amazon is taking customers. Margins are tight. If we lose Children's Events Book Club, Saturday storytelling, we lose our biggest traffic generator. And I don't know if we can survive without that." Painful pause. tears in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes. "They're suggesting that maybe you take time off, temporary leave, just until things completely calm down, until there are no more questions." Sophie's world tilted. "You're firing me, not an accusation. A devastating statement of fact. Not firing," Mrs. Whitmore said quickly. "Leave, with partial pay, 20 hours a week instead of 40. Keep benefits. And as soon as possible, as soon as the atmosphere changes, I'll bring you back full time. And if the atmosphere doesn't change, if perception never completely changes, silence." The answer was in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes. She would choose business survival over employee, not because he didn't care, but because he had to choose. It was brutal math for small business owners. "How long?" Sophie asked. Her voice was empty now. 2 weeks initially. "Then we'll reassess based on community feedback. If events return, if sales stabilize, and if they don't stabilize, then we have a difficult conversation." Euphemism for permanent dismissal. Sophie nodded. "I understand. When does it start?" "Monday." "I'm sorry, dear. Really sorry. If there were another way." "It's okay," Sophie said. Wasn't, but what more could she say? Forcing Mrs. Whitmore to choose between her and the store would only hasten the inevitable. "Thank you for letting me know." She left the office before the tears she had been holding back fell. Sophie left the meeting stunned. She walked through the store she had managed for 8 years. Shelves she had organized. Displays she had created. Events she had planned. And she realized she was losing everything. Not for having done something wrong, but for having done something right that the city had decided was suspect. That night, she needed to leave her apartment. The walls were closing in. So she went to the market to buy groceries. Mundane task that would give the illusion of normalcy. But it wasn't normal, because the moment she walked in, she felt it. Stares. Not obvious ones, but there. People looking away when she made eye contact. Whispers that stopped when she passed. And in the dairy aisle, she saw Jennifer Morrison, a mother who had brought twins for story time for 2 years. Sophie considered whether she should say hi. She decided to try for normalcy. "Hi, Jennifer," she said. A small smile, an attempt at a bridge. Jennifer looked. Her expression hardened. And she did something Sophie would never forget. She took her 5-year-old son's hand and physically pulled him back, away from Sophie, as if proximity was danger. "Come on, Jacob, we need to go." A tone that allowed no argument, and she left, leaving Sophie standing, alone in the aisle, and something broke inside her. Not dramatically with tears or a public collapse, but silently, internally, a true acceptance she had tried to deny. It didn't matter what she did. No matter how many official statements came, she would always be an outsider. She would always be suspect. And kindness, the most basic act of humanity, had been transformed into evidence that she didn't belong. She paid for groceries, driven home, climbed the stairs to her apartment, and sat in the dark, processing the magnitude of isolation, and realized no one would defend her. Family didn't want association for fear of harming business. The community had decided the narrative. And the only person who had stood by her was Ethan, a sheriff she barely knew. And that didn't seem enough against the weight of the entire town. Ethan showed up at the apartment that night, unannounced, 9:15. A knock on the door that made Sophie jump because she wasn't expecting visitors. She checked the peephole, saw him, opened it. "Ethan, what are you?" "I saw a statement from the town council," he said, entering without waiting for an invitation because he saw her expression, "about children's events being temporarily suspended at Pages and Poetry. And I heard through sources that you were put on leave." "Gossip travels at the speed of light in a small town," Sophie said, trying to sound indifferent, failing. "It's not fair. You didn't do anything wrong. Fairness isn't how the world works," Sophie said, sitting on the sofa because her legs wouldn't hold her up anymore. "It isn't, but sometimes it is, when someone fights for it." Ethan paused. But I didn't come just about that. There's a more pressing reason. He sat down, not expecting an invitation. Tom signaled seriousness. Investigation I was working on. Narcotics trafficking. I discovered something today that complicates everything. Warehouse you were checking when Emma got lost. Connected to a much larger operation than I thought. Not just local distribution, but a network that spans 3 states. And there's evidence, strong evidence that some officers in Ridgemont may be involved. Receiving payments to ignore activity, to alert when investigations happen. Which officers? Sophie asked. Already suspicious. Potentially including Jensen, the officer who interrogated you. Confirmation. And the problem is, if he's involved, and if he thinks you know something even, if you don't too, could be perceived as a threat. A potential witness. Or someone who could complicate their operation. But I don't know anything, Sophie protested. Literally nothing, besides having found Emma. But he doesn't know what you know. And corrupt men who have a lot to lose don't assume innocence. They assume threat. And they eliminate threats before they become problems. Silence, as the implication sank. Are you saying I'm in danger? Real danger. I'm saying you need to be careful. Very careful. Always lock doors. Your routine. Don't leave at the same time every day. Don't take the same routes. And call me if anything, anyone, any situation seems wrong. Even slightly. Ethan picked up the phone. My number. Save it. Call anytime. You're scaring me, Sophie said. Raw honesty. Well, Ethan said. Because the situation is scary. And I'm not going to pretend it isn't just to make you feel better. But I also won't let anything happen to you. I promise that. And Sophia, a woman who had learned not to trust strangers' promises, found that she believed him. Against all logic, against all experience, she believed him. But 3 days later, proof came that Ethan's fear was completely justified. Tuesday night, Sophie had gone for her walk. A habit she'd had for years. 10 o'clock at night, quiet streets, half an hour to clear her head. She knew Ethan had said to vary her routine. But walking was her anchor, her sanity, so she went. And she was returning 10:30, 2 blocks from her apartment, when a man emerged from an alley. Not an accident. Deliberate. Blocking her path. Sophie didn't recognize him. Maybe in his 30s. Dark leather jacket. A body that suggested time spent at the gym or doing physical work. And an expression hard, calculated, that set Sophie's internal alarms off. Sophie Chen, he said, confirming his identity. Not a casual question. Yes. Her voice came out less firm than she wanted. Who are you? Who I am doesn't matter. I have a message for you. He took a step closer. Sophie took a step back. A message from people who don't appreciate complications. Stop asking questions. Stop acting like a sheriff. And especially stop acting like a victim when all you did was meddle where you weren't wanted. Because if you don't stop, if you keep causing problems, things get much more complicated. For you, understood? I'm not doing, Sophie began. Automatic denial. He took another step. Too close now. Invading personal space. Threatening. Understood. He repeated, a tone that wouldn't accept argument. Real fear now. Not abstract anxiety, but visceral terror of being alone on a dark street with a man who clearly intended to intimidate, and possibly worse. Understood, Sophie said, making herself small. Non-confrontational, survival instinct. Good. So let's be clear. And he left. Simply walked. Disappeared into the alley from where he had come, leaving Sophie standing there, trembling, heart pounding so hard she could hear blood in her ears. Took a moment for her legs to work. Then she ran. Not dignified, not careful, just pure panic. Covered 2 blocks in record time. Climbed stairs. Hands trembling so violently she could barely put a key in a lock. Finally, she opened it, entered, locked it, chain, deadbolt, everything. And then she processed. The threat had been real. Not implied. Explicit. Stop asking questions. Stop being seen with the sheriff. or things will get complicated." Sophie picked up the phone. The only person she knew, she could trust. She dialed the number Ethan had saved. He answered on the first ring, as if expecting it. "Sophie." "Ethan." His voice breaking. A man stopped me. "In the street," he said. "He told me to stop asking questions. To stop being seen with you. He threatened that if I didn't stop, things would get complicated." Silence for a second. Then, "Are you home now?" "Safe." "Yes. I locked everything. Stay there. Don't open the door for anyone except me. I'm coming. 10 minutes. "Ethan, you don't have 10 minutes. And he hung up. And Sophie sat down, still trembling, and she realized danger was no longer theoretical. It was real, immediate, and she was completely alone except for Sheriff, who had entered her life by accident, and who was now the only thing between her and people who were clearly willing to hurt her to protect secrets. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the moral dilemma Ethan faced, that night sitting in his car outside Sophie's apartment at 11 o'clock, engine off, watching her windows to make sure she was safe, wasn't simply about tactics or logistics. It was about fundamental identity. About what kind of man he was when choices truly mattered. About whether distinctiveness defined him, or whether humanity defined him. And it was a confrontation with a hidden truth he had been avoiding for years, that he had sacrificed relationships, family, his own soul, on the altar of serving and protecting to the point where he had forgotten why he had started. And Sophia, a woman he barely knew, but who had become central in a way he couldn't explain, was forcing him to decide who he really was. And that decision would have consequences that would change everything. Ethan had a dilemma. A real one. A complicated one. The kind that didn't have a clear answer in a training manual or code of ethics. Sophie was clearly in danger. Directly threatened by someone connected to his investigation, probably an associate of a trafficking ring he was dismantling. An instinct honed by 15 years as a law enforcement officer, that had kept him alive in dangerous situations, that was rarely wrong-screamed. Protect her, keep her safe, stay with her physically until the threat passes, or until criminals are arrested. Don't delegate. Don't assume others will do the job properly. Do it personally. But there were complications. Dozens of them. Each one significant. Each one potentially destructive. First, he was sheriff. Not just an officer. An elected sheriff. A public figure whose actions were scrutinized. And Sophie was a civilian who had recently been even if falsely, even if unjustly, publicly accused of suspicious behavior involving a child. Being seen with her frequently would inevitably generate gossip. Why does sheriff spend so much time with a woman who's been questioned? Is there something going on between them? This seems inappropriate, and gossip wouldn't stay contained. It would spread. It would reach the city council that determined his budget. It would reach voters who would decide whether to keep him in office in the next election in 18 months. It would potentially damage not only his reputation, but his ability to do his job effectively. Second complication. His investigation was at a critical point. He had identified key players. He was building cases. But the network was still active. What if criminals knew he was protecting Sophie personally? They could use her as leverage. Kidnap her to force him to back down. Or worse, hurt her to send a message. This is what happens when sheriff becomes personally involved. Protecting her personally could actually increase the danger for her. A paradox that had no easy solution. Third, and perhaps most painful, Rachel, his ex-wife, who was already threatening custody based on allegations of his unstable lifestyle. You work 60, 70 hours a week. You miss recitals. You forget birthdays. You consistently put work above our daughter. And the judge had been sympathetic to her argument. Shared custody, but with a warning. Any further evidence of Ethan prioritizing work over fatherhood would result in a reassessment. What if Rachel found out he was involved, romantically or even platonically, with a woman who had been under suspicion? That he was staying at her apartment? that he was dividing his attention between Emma and protecting Sophie. Perfect. Ammunition. See, Judge, he's doing it again. Getting involved in complicated situations, putting work and whatever that is above our daughter. Emma needs stability. She needs a father who is present, not constantly distracted. And Ethan would lose Emma, not completely, but he would lose time. He would lose moments. He would lose the connection he was desperately trying to rebuild. And yet, despite all the complications, all the risks, all the potential consequences, leaving Sophie alone was unthinkable. Literally unthinkable. The man had threatened her. He had stopped her in the street, invaded her personal space, made it clear that violence was on the table if she didn't obey. And Ethan knew from years of experience prosecuting cases, interrogating suspects, seeing how criminals operated, that threats like these weren't empty. They were warnings. First steps in an escalation that ended with real violence. Sophie was in genuine danger, and leaving her to face it alone because protecting her was inconvenient or risky for his career. Unthinkable. So he had to choose career and custody versus conscience, protocol and reputation protection versus protecting a real person who needed help, the system he had sworn to serve versus the humanity he had sworn to protect. And the choice would reveal who he really was, not who he pretended to be, but who he fundamentally was when everything was at stake. Ethan arrived at Sophie's apartment at 11:05, 8 minutes after hanging up the phone. Not 10, as he'd promised. He drove faster than he should have, ignoring 2 stop signs in an emergency to get there. He parked. He went up the stairs. He knocked. Sophie opened immediately. She'd been waiting at the door and looking at her persistent fear, relief at seeing him, vulnerability she'd been trying to hide, made the decision for him. He went in. Are you okay? Did he physically hurt you? No. Just threatened, intimidated. She was hugging herself, small, trying to take up less space as if that would make her safer. Describe him. Everything you remember. Sophie recounted. Details approximate. Height, build, clothes. And Ethan recognized the description. Not the name, but the type. Contracted muscle. Enforcer used by narcotics networks for messages exactly like this. You did the right thing, calling, he said. And I'll stay. Tonight. And however many nights it takes until we catch whoever did this. Ethan, you can't, Sophie began. I can, and I will. Non-negotiable, but it's your job. If people see, let them see. Let them talk. A sheriff's job is to protect citizens, and you're a citizen under threat for helping my daughter. So I'll stay. He paused. But I won't stay in the apartment if it makes you uncomfortable. I can stay in the car. Watch from there. In the car all night. It wouldn't be the first time. Stakeouts are part of the job. You'll freeze. It's March. Still cold at night. Concern for him despite his own fear. Revealing. I'll be fine. No, Sophie decided. If you're going to stay, stay inside. On the sofa. I have extra blankets. And honestly, it makes me feel safer knowing you're inside. Not out there where I can't see. And Ethan spent 2 hours struggling with himself about accepting it. He sat in the car initially, just watching, processing the choice, because staying in her apartment was a line that, once crossed, couldn't be undone. It would change the nature of their relationship. It would transform it from sheriff helping citizen into something more personal, more complicated. He thought about Emma, about how Rachel would use this. He's staying in the apartment of a woman he barely knows. What kind of example does that set for our daughter? He thought about his career, about how the city council would react, about the next election. He thought about the investigation, about how criminals would use information he was personally involved in. And then he thought about Sophie, alone in her apartment, scared, no family to call, no community that believed in her, no one but him. And he realized there were times when doing the right thing cost something, where principles had a price, and this was one of those times. And the kind of man he was would be defined not by the choice he made when it was easy, but by the choice he made when it cost everything. At 2 in the morning, he decided. He got out of the car, he went upstairs, he knocked on the door. Sophie opened it. Clearly, she hadn't slept. Still dressed in the same clothes. Her eyes showed a persistent fear that hadn't diminished in the hours he'd been sitting outside. "Ethan, can I come in?" She stepped back. He entered. He closed the door behind him. "Decision," he began, his voice firm because he'd struggled with it long enough to be sure. "I'll stay here. Not in the car, not in the apartment, but here. On the sofa. Watching. Until we resolve this. Until we catch whoever threatened you. Until you're safe." "You can't do that," Sophie protested, even though there was relief in her voice. "Your job, Emma, your life, Rachel will use this against you. The city will talk, and people who threatened you will know I'm being protected, and they might my life." Ethan interrupted. "Includes making sure innocent people aren't hurt because I'm investigating criminals. You're innocent. You did nothing but help a lost child. And you're in danger because of it. Because you helped my daughter. So, yes, I'll stay. And I'll deal with Rachel and advice and gossip as it comes. What if it hurts you? Professionally? Personally? What if you lose Emma because of it? Then I deal with the consequences. Because the alternative, leaving you vulnerable, leaving you alone, facing a real threat, is not an option I can live with. It's not the kind of man I want to be." Sophie looked into his eyes, searching. "Why? You barely know me. We've known each other for what? A week? Why risk so much for an essentially stranger?" Fair question. It deserved an honest answer. Ethan considered carefully. "Because when Emma was lost," he began, "when I spent those 3 hours searching, thinking I'd lost her because I'd put work above her safety, I realized something. That I had become exactly the kind of officer I swore I'd never be. The kind who puts cases above people. Badge above humanity. Who had sacrificed marriage, relationship with his daughter, his own soul on the altar of serve and protect. To the point where I'd forgotten who I was serving and why I was protecting them. And I swore if Emma was found safe that I would change. That I would put people above protocol. Humanity above ambition. That I would remember that a badge doesn't define me. Actions define me. Choices define me. Pause, and you're a test. A person who needs protection that will cost something, that will complicate life, that will generate judgment. And what if I don't stay? What if I choose career and convenience over doing what I know is right? I proved that I haven't changed at all. That I'm still a man who puts his badge above everything else. And I can't be that man anymore. I refuse to be." Raw honesty that Sophie hadn't expected. Vulnerability she rarely saw in authority figures. "Then stay," she said, small but firm voice. "Not in the car where you'll freeze. Here, on the sofa. I have blankets, pillows, and it makes me feel safe, knowing you're here. That I'm not completely alone." And Ethan accepted. Not because he wanted the complication that inevitably came, but because it was right. And for the first time in years, maybe since he had become sheriff, the choice between doing what was right and doing what protected his career was obvious. And he chose right, even knowing it would cost him. Because the kind of man he was mattered more than the kind of sheriff he was. And that distinction made all the difference. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because the transformation that occurred during those 5 nights Ethan stayed at Sophie's apartment wasn't just about physical protection or threat reduction. It was the journey of 2 deeply lonely people, both having chosen isolation as a defense mechanism. Both having been wounded by past connections, slowly discovering that shared vulnerability could create a different kind of strength. It was a gradual process of building trust, not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent moments of choosing to be present. And it was a growing recognition that the connection they were forming went far beyond circumstance and became something neither had planned but both secretly desired. Ethan stayed 5 nights. Officially, because the threat was real and immediate. The man had directly threatened Sophie, And until they identified and arrested him, she wasn't safe. But a deeper reality, a truth they both recognized but didn't articulate, was that something more was growing. Something that had begun with gratitude and evolved through shared crisis into a connection that seemed both inevitable and terrifying. The first night was purely professional, at least superficially. Ethan on the sofa with the blanket Sophie provided. She in the small room with the door left open because she didn't want to appear to have something to hide. "If anyone asks," she said, "the door was open. Nothing inappropriate." "Nothing is inappropriate," Ethan assured her. "I'm here as an officer, providing protection to a citizen under threat. Protocol allows this when there is immediate danger and limited resources." But protocol didn't explain why Ethan hadn't slept much. Not because the couch was uncomfortable, it was surprisingly okay considering his age, but because he was listening, hyper-aware of every sound, every car passing on the street, every step on the outside stairs, every creak of the old building settling in, alert to any indication of approaching threat. And also, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, aware of Sophie in the room. He could hear her breathing eventually deepening as she finally fell asleep after hours of fear-induced insomnia. And there was something about being in her space, surrounded by her books and personal belongings, a faint scent of something floral he couldn't identify, that made him feel not intrusive, but trusted, as if she had allowed him into her world. And that trust meant something. In the morning, 6 o'clock, a decade's habit of waking up early, Ethan got up, silently, not wanting to wake Sophie, and he made coffee. Because he needed caffeine to function, and because it was a small gesture of reciprocity. She had offered him space. He could offer him coffee. Sophie emerged from her room at 6:30. Messy hair, sleepwear sweatpants, and an oversized t-shirt. No makeup. A more vulnerable and real version of herself than anyone he'd ever seen. "You're already awake," she said. An obvious statement, but she needed to say something. "Habit. I always wake up early." Pause. "I hope you don't mind that I made coffee. I need it to function. You know where things are." Surprised, he'd navigated her kitchen. "The kitchen is small," Ethan said. A small smile. "It wasn't hard to find. And you organize it logically. Coffee near the coffee maker. Mugs in the cupboard above. Makes sense." And they shared coffee, sitting at the small two-seater table in the corner of the kitchen, and they talked, not about threats or investigations, but about life, Emma and how she was adjusting to shared custody. Difficult, sometimes. She asks why mommy and daddy don't live together anymore. And I don't know how to explain that adults sometimes make bad choices that hurt people they love. His work and the cases that landed with him. A bookstore is struggling to keep it open. Amazon is killing small businesses, and people want convenience over community. I understand, but it hurts to watch. And there was ease in the conversations, no performance, no attempt to impress. Just two people sharing the realities of their lives. Second night, Sophie cooked. "You're protecting. The least I can do is feed." Light tone, but meaning behind it. Recognition that Ethan was sacrificing time, comfort, potentially reputation, to keep her safe. She made something simple. Pasta with a sauce she'd made from canned tomatoes and fresh herbs from the windowsill. Garlic bread, salad, but it was delicious in the way that carefully made homemade food always is. And they talked more. Deeper this time. Sophie told her about family. About her parents, Wei and Lin, who had immigrated with nothing and built a life through impossible work. And sometimes I feel like I've let them down. They sacrificed everything to give me opportunities. And I chose literature. I manage a bookstore that barely survives. Not a doctor, or a lawyer, or an engineer. Not something that justifies their sacrifice. Real guilt in her voice. "You connect. People with stories," Ethan said, looking directly at her. "That matters. More than you realize. Because stories are how we learn empathy. How we see through the eyes of others. How we understand that we are not alone." And maybe that matters more than practical professions, because it makes us human, instead of just functional. Sophie paused, processing. Nobody ever put it like that. So nobody was paying attention properly. And Sophie realized, Ethan understood. Not superficially, but deeply. He saw value in work that the world often minimized, and that meant more than he could express. Third night, complication arose. Rachel had called an unexpected work trip. Could Ethan take Emma for the whole weekend instead of just Saturday? And Ethan had a dilemma. He couldn't leave Sophie unprotected, but he also couldn't say no to extra time with Emma. So he did the only thing that made sense. Can I bring Emma here? I know it's asking a lot, but I can't leave you alone. And I don't want to waste time with my daughter? Of course, Sophie said. Without hesitation, I love Emma, and I have books. Lots of books. She loved them. And Emma came. And it was revealing. Sophie didn't just tolerate the presence of a 5-year-old in a small space. She blossomed. She played with Emma. She read stories in different voices that made Emma laugh. She helped with drawings. She answered a million questions that children ask with genuine patience. And Ethan watched. Really watched. The woman who had saved Emma on the road was now making her feel completely safe and loved in a strange apartment. And something changed in him. A fundamental shift. Recognition that Sophie wasn't just someone he was protecting. Not just a civilian under threat that was his professional responsibility. She was someone who could be a part of his life. Of Emma's life. Of a future he had stopped imagining was possible after the divorce. Fourth night, after Emma was asleep, in Sophie's room because Sophie had insisted. A child needs a proper bed, and had taken the couch herself. Fethin and Sophie sat down, late, after 10. Both exhausted from a day caring for an energetic child, but not wanting the day to end. Not wanting the conversations to stop. Can I ask you something? Sophie said, quiet voice. Intimate in the way late-night conversations are. Always. Anything. Why, Sheriff? Why this job specifically? Because I know it's not just about salary or benefits. There's something more. A question that went straight to the heart of the matter. Ethan considered it. Because I saw injustice when I was a child. I grew up in a community of migrant workers. My father took seasonal work, harvesting, construction, anything that paid. And I saw from a very young age how he was treated as less than human. By farmers who employed him. By police officers who stopped him for suspicious driving when he was just going to work. By an entire system that saw him as exploitable and disposable. And I vowed that when I grew up, I would be a different kind of officer. The kind who saw people, not categories. Who treated everyone, no matter their origin or status, with dignity. Who wore a badge to protect the vulnerable, instead of oppressing them. Pause. Did you succeed? Sophie asked gently. To be that kind of officer? I try, Ethan admitted. I don't always succeed. There are days when I fail. When protocol trumps humanity. When I take shortcuts or make judgments based on appearance. But I try, consciously, every day, to be better than the officers who treated my father as less than human. Silence, comfortable, contemplative. And you? Ethan asked. Why books? Why this specific love for stories? Because, when the world was very difficult, when I was an Asian child in a white city, when I had no friends, when I didn't fit in anywhere, books were where I belonged, where I could be anyone. A heroine, an adventurer, a magician. Where difference was a virtue, not a flaw. And I wanted to give that to others. Especially children like Emma. Children who maybe don't fit in perfectly. Who need an escape, who need to know they're not alone. That there are worlds where they completely belong. You're a good person, Sophie Chen, Ethan said. Not performatively, but as a genuine observation. You too, Ethan Cole, Sophie replied. And a moment hung between them. Recognition that something was changing. That the line between protector and protected, between official and civilian, between strangers thrown together by circumstance, was blurring, and becoming something more. Fifth night, a breakthrough came. Ethan received a call. His partner had identified the man who threatened Sophie, Kyle Brennan, a known associate of a narcotics network. He had a record, a history of assault, and they had arrested him in an unrelated traffic stop. When they processed the case, they discovered an outstanding warrant, and when questioned, he admitted to being sent to message Sophie. "You're safe now," Ethan said, relief and something more in his voice. "Brennan is in custody, and without him on the streets, the immediate threat has passed. I can go, let you return to your normal life, okay?" Sophie said, and she couldn't completely hide the disappointment in her voice. "I understand, and thank you for everything, for staying, for protecting." For she didn't finish because she didn't know how to express the magnitude of what he had done. "But, Sophie," Ethan interrupted, "before I go, I need to say something." Pause, choosing words. "These 5 days, here, they weren't just about protection for me. They were significant. You are significant. In a way I didn't expect. In a way I don't fully know how to process yet. But I know I don't want this to end. That I don't want to go back to a life where you're not." "You too," Sophie admitted. "Vulnerability meeting vulnerability. It's significant. You are significant. So when the dust has completely settled, when the investigation closes, when the inevitable gossip stops, can I take you to dinner? Real, not protection, not circumstance. Just us. Exploring what this is." "Yes," Sophie said, smiling for the first time in days. "Yes, I would love to." And Ethan left. But they both knew something had begun. Something real and fragile and frightening and full of possibility. And it would be worth every complication that inevitably came. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because the partial resolution that came 2 weeks after that 5th night when Ethan finally left Sophie's apartment but left a part of himself. There wasn't just about a criminal case closing or a diminishing threat. It was about Sophie's public vindication after weeks of being treated as a suspect. It was about Ethan proving what kind of sheriff he chose to be mattered more than politics or protocol. And it was about a small town being forced to confront its own prejudices and admit reluctantly, gradually, that it had misjudged. But more than anything, it was about 2 people discovering that a connection forged in crisis not only survived in normalcy, but thrived, and that a future neither had dared to imagine was becoming possible. 2 weeks after that last conversation where Ethan had left the apartment but promised a real date, the investigation closed. Not dramatically with a shootout or chase, but methodically and completely as good investigations do. Ethan and his team had built a solid case. Evidence from Kyle Brennan, the man who had threatened Sophie, led to associates, which led to distributors, which led to the source. The entire network mapped and dismantled. 8 arrests in total, including and this was particular validation for Ethan officer Brad Jensen, the officer who had questioned Sophie with suspicion, who had planted seeds of doubt in the community. It turned out that Jensen had been on the payroll for 18 months, receiving $3,000 a month to ignore specific activity and alert when investigations were happening. Complete betrayal of badge and community. And when the news broke headlines in the local newspaper, coverage on regional TV stations, Ethan received public recognition. Sheriff Cole dismantles multi-state narcotics network, interviews, recognition from the governor, praise from a community that had been skeptical of his leadership, and in every interview, Ethan made a point of mentioning, "The investigation was almost compromised when my daughter got lost, but a citizen, Sophie Chun, found her and kept her safe. Her action allowed the investigation to continue. She deserves recognition, not the suspicion she initially received. Deliberate public vindication." And Sophie felt the impact. People who had avoided her began waving in the street. Calls came in, not many, but some apologizing. "Sorry for assuming worse. I was wrong." The city council held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to reverse the suspension of children's events at Pages and Poetry. In light of recent revelations about Officer Jensen's corruption and Sheriff Cole's statements, the council recognizes that initial judgments about Ms. Chen were unfounded. Mrs. Whitmore appeared at the bookstore the next day, this time smiling. "Sophie, dear, good news. The board reversed the decision. Events can return. And I want you back full-time, 40 hours, full pay, immediately." Really? Relief and something like anger, because she shouldn't have been taken away in the first place. Really? And Sophie, I'm sorry for not fighting harder, for letting pressure influence me. You deserved better. It didn't erase the pain, but it helped. And the town eventually, reluctantly, because small towns change slowly, accepted that it had judged wrongly. Not everyone. There were always people who clung to the initial narratives, but enough that Sophie could walk through the market without feeling stares, could work without fear of losing her job, could breathe without the constant weight of being seen as a threat. And the following Saturday, when storytime returned, 7 children showed up, not 15 as before, but 7, including Jennifer Morrison's twins. "I'm sorry," Jennifer said when she brought them in, "for pulling Jacob away, for making things worse. It wasn't fair to you. Thank you for saying so," Sophie replied. "And thank you for bringing them back. Not friendship, but the beginning of mending." Their first real date happened 3 weeks after the investigation closed. Ethan had waited deliberately. "I don't want our first date to be about the case or the investigation. I want it to be about us." So he waited until the dust settled, until life returned to a more normal rhythm. And then he called. "Dinner, Friday." "I'd love it," Sophie said, her heart racing in ways that hadn't in years. He picked her up at 7, not in uniform. Casual, but nice. Clothes. And he took her not to a restaurant in Ridgemont, but 2 towns away. "Privacy," he explained. "I don't want our first date to be a spectacle for the whole town." Small Italian restaurant, low lights, soft music. The kind of place where conversations were private and the atmosphere encouraged honesty. And they talked. Not about the case or threat or trauma they had shared, but about life, dreams, fears. Sophie talked about wanting to write children's books someday. "I have a notebook full of stories. I've never shown them to anyone. But Emma made me think I should try." "You should," Ethan encouraged. "You're natural with children, and the way you tell stories. Magical. Children need that." He shared about wanting to eventually leave active law enforcement. Not immediately, but someday. Maybe teach. Police academy. Pass on knowledge without physical risk. So Emma doesn't grow up worrying every day that daddy won't come home. And at the end of the night, Ethan walked Sophie to the door. And there was a moment, a "shall we kiss" kind of tension. And Ethan asked, he didn't assume it. "Can I kiss you? Please," Sophie said. And he kissed her. Gentle, not rushed. A promise of more instead of a demand for everything. And when they separated, they were both smiling. "Can I do this again?" Ethan asked. "Date? Not just once, but regularly." "Please," Sophie repeated. And they began. The following months were built. Slow, deliberate, careful. Because both had been hurt. Ethan by a divorce that had crushed him. Sophie by a lifetime of rejection. Both had complications and custody agreements. Rachel and her constant judgment. Sophie's parents and unspoken hopes. Community and inevitable gossip. But it was real. Not a movie romance, where everything was perfect. But a relationship built on a foundation of trust established during crisis, and strengthened through consistent choices to show up, to be honest, to choose each other even when it was inconvenient. Ethan introduced Sophie to his parents Maria and Carlos Cole, who lived in a nearby community. "This is Sophie. She is important." Maria hugged Sophie immediately. "Anyone my son looks at the way he looks at you is welcome." Carlos was more reserved, but eventually said, "Ethan is happier than I've seen him in years. You do this." "Thank you." Sophie introduced Ethan to her parents. Wei and Lin Chen were cautious initially. "Sheriff, isn't this complicated?" "It is," Sophie admitted, "but it's worth the complication." Emma adored Sophie completely. She asked to see her. She wanted Sophie in recitals. She drew family pictures that included Daddy, herself, and Sophie. And gradually, "Can I see Sophie?" became, "When is Sophie coming to dinner?" became, "Can Sophie read bedtime stories?" Natural integration of a child who saw no complication, just someone who cared about her. Rachel was less enthusiastic. "You're dating a woman who was questioned by the police about our daughter. She was unjustly suspected of helping our daughter," Ethan corrected, "and she was completely vindicated. Even so, that seems questionable." But eventually, when she saw how Emma loved Sophie, how the relationship was clearly healthy and stable, Rachel accepted it, reluctantly. "If Emma is happy, I won't interfere. But if something changes, if there's a problem, there won't be," Ethan promised. And he meant it. 6 months after their first date, Ethan showed up at the bookstore, a regular Tuesday, 3 in the afternoon. Sophie was helping a customer choose a birthday present. He waited, browsing shelves, picking up random books. And when the customer finally left, he said, "Sophie, can I show you something?" "Sure. What outside?" "Come on." A tone that signaled significance. Sophie went outside. Ethan's pickup truck was parked. He opened the back door. There was a box, not big, shoebox size. "Open it," he said. And there was a nervousness in his voice that Sophie had never heard. Sophie opened it. Inside, a key, a unique one, on a new keychain, and folded paper. She unfolded it. Deed, legal documents, and an address she recognized, property in the mountains outside Ridgemont that she had mentioned months ago as perfect if I could ever afford it. "Ethan, what is this?" "It's ours," he said. "Simple, if you want it. A house, small, 3 bedrooms, big yard, in the mountains where you always wanted to be. A place where we can build a life together, where Emma has space to play, where you have the peace you deserve, where we are, us, family. If that's what you want." "You bought a house," Sophie said, processing. "Technically, I'm still finalizing the paperwork. It closes next week. But yes, because I love you, Sophie Chen. I love you in ways I didn't know I was still capable of loving. And I want a future. Not vague, someday, but real. Let's make this happen. And I know it's fast. I know there are complications. But I also know that when you find the right person, speed doesn't matter. Certainty matters. And I'm certain of you." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes now. "You're sure? Even with everything? With my baggage, with a city that never fully accepted me? Especially with all of that," Ethan interrupted. "Because all of that made you who you are. And I love who you are. Completely." And Sophia, woman who had learned not to expect happiness, who had built her entire life around protecting herself from disappointment, who had accepted solitude as the price of security, realized that the answer was more obvious than anything she had ever known. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I want this. I want you. I want Emma. I want the life we're building. Yes." And she hugged him. They're on Main Street, in front of the bookstore where she worked, not caring who saw, not caring about the gossip that inevitably followed. Because for the first time in her entire life, she had found a place where she belonged. And it wasn't a geographical place. It was a person. It was Ethan, it was Emma. It was the family they were building, not through blood, but through the consistent choice of choosing each other. And that was worth everything. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because the year that followed that hug on Main Street, when Sophie said yes to a future with Ethan and Emma, wasn't just a period of uncomplicated happiness. It was a journey of truly building a shared life, of navigating the complexities of a blended family, of Sophie learning to be a mother figure to the child, who wasn't biologically hers but whom she loved as if she were, of Ethan establishing boundaries with work he had ignored for years, And of all three, discovering that family wasn't defined by blood or convention but by the daily choice to show up for each other. And it was precisely when they began to believe they had finally found peace, when they lowered their guard and allowed themselves to imagine a future without constant threat, that the past returned with a vengeance. And the revelation that someone still wanted to destroy them was a brutal reminder that transformation is never complete, and that some battles have to be fought repeatedly. A year after that day when Ethan presented the key and the deed, Sophie and Ethan lived in a house in the mountains. Not a mansion, but a 3-bedroom house on 1.5 acres of land, with a breathtaking valley view every morning. Pine trees surrounded the property. A small stream ran through a corner of the land where Emma loved to hunt frogs. A large porch where they sat on summer nights and watched the stars without the light pollution of the city. It was exactly what Sophie had dreamed of, and more, because it was filled with people she loved. Emma had her own room painted in lavender that she had chosen, decorated with posters of favorite book characters, a bookshelf full of stories that Sophie read every night. One more page. Emma always begged, and Sophie always gave in because those moments, child, nestled against her, trusting completely, were precious beyond measure. Sophie still worked part-time at the bookstore. She couldn't quit completely pages, and poetry was a part of her, but she'd cut it down to 20 hours a week. And she used the rest of her time writing children's books, stories about kids who didn't fit and finding magic in their differences, about kindness being rewarded, about families being defined by love instead of blood. Her first book, The Girl Who Collected Stories, had been accepted by a small publisher. Publication scheduled for next year, and Sophie was working on her second. Writing was lonely, but satisfying in ways retail never had been. It was creating instead of just facilitating, and she loved it. Ethan was still sheriff, but he'd set boundaries he hadn't had before. No work after 6 unless it was a real emergency. Weekends reserved for family. And he'd started delegating more, trusting deputies he'd carefully vetted after Jensen's betrayal. "I can't do everything," he admitted to Sophie one night. "And trying cost me my marriage, and almost cost me my relationship with Emma. I'm not going to make that mistake again." And life was good. A simple word that didn't fully capture it, but was truer than any other. Better than good. Because it wasn't just the absence of problems, it was the presence of joy. Family dinners, where Emma chatted about school and friends. Weekends where they hiked trails or visited Sophie's parents or Ethan's parents. Nights where, after Emma was asleep, Sophie and Ethan sat on the porch and talked about everything and nothing. Building intimacy through 1,000 small moments instead of one grand gesture. And Sophie, who had lived 32 years believing that belonging wasn't for her, discovered that she belonged here, completely, without reservations, without the persistent fear of being rejected. She simply belonged. Then one Thursday afternoon, exactly a year and 2 weeks after Emma got lost and Sophie found her, the event that had started everything there was a knock at the door. 3 o'clock. Sophie was in a small office they had converted from an extra bedroom, working on a manuscript. Ethan was at work. Emma was at school. Sophie wasn't expecting visitors. They never did. The property was isolated. There was no reason for anyone to show up unannounced. Then the knock made her pause, cautious but not alarmed. Maybe a delivery, or a neighbor, though the closest one was half a mile away. She went to the door, opened it, and a woman was there, in her early 40s, blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, navy blue suit, leather briefcase, an expression that was professionally neutral but with undertones of judgment that Sophie recognized from a lifetime of being evaluated. "Sophie Chen," the woman said, confirming her identity. "Yes." Immediate caution because something in the woman's posture screamed authority. "Who are you?" "My name is Victoria Hartley. I'm a social worker with the County Department of Child Protective Services." She showed her badge. "Official credentials. I received a concerning report about you having inappropriate contact with a minor. Specifically Emma Cole, 6 years old. and I need to investigate immediately. May I come in? The world stopped, not gradually, instantly, as if time had frozen and Sophie was trapped in an impossible moment. What? No. There is a mistake. I didn't, Mrs. Chen. I understand this is disturbing, but the report was made by a source alleging valid concerns, and I am legally obligated to investigate all allegations involving child safety, so I need to enter, inspect the living environment, ask about the nature of your relationship with the minor, and determine if further investigation is necessary. Tom wouldn't allow refusal, but Emma is. Ethan and we're family. We live together. I help raise her, trying to explain, but words weren't coming out correctly because panic was setting in. I understand, and that will be part of the investigation. But until I determine the facts, I need to proceed with standard protocol. May I enter? Or do I need to return with a warrant and a police officer? A poorly veiled threat. Sophie recoiled. Come in. Because what choice did she have? Refusal felt like guilt, and she had nothing to hide. Victoria Hartley entered, and immediately began assessing, eyes scanning the room, the kitchen, noticing details, taking mental notes that Sophie could see being cataloged. You live here with Sheriff Ethan Cole and his daughter Emma. Yes, for 6 months. And the nature of your relationship with Sheriff Cole? We're partners, dating, living together. Not married yet, but planning to eventually. And with Emma, I take care of her. When Ethan works, I take her to school sometimes. I help with homework. I read her stories before bed. I cook. Things a parental figure does. So you consider yourself a parental figure even though you're not her legal or biological mother? Yes, not officially, but functionally, yes. Victoria made a note. And are you aware that there's a history of you being investigated for inappropriate behavior involving a minor? That was a misunderstanding. A year ago, Emma got lost. I found her. I helped. And I was completely vindicated. Sheriff Cole made a public statement. I'm aware of the statement. But the fact remains that there was an initial investigation. And now a new report alleges that you used that incident to gain access to the child. That your relationship with Sheriff Cole may be motivated by inappropriate interest in his daughter, rather than a genuine adult relationship, an accusation so absurd that Sophie almost laughed. Except there was nothing funny about it. That's ridiculous. Completely false. Who made the report? Reports are confidential. I can't disclose sources, but I need to know who's making accusations. I need to be able to defend myself. Mrs. Chen, I understand your frustration, but the process is designed to protect both the accuser and the accused. And at this moment, I need to focus on Emma's safety. Victoria continued her inspection. She checked Emma's room, the bathroom. Looking for it, Sophie didn't know. Signs of abuse, of neglect. There were none because Emma was loved, cared for, thriving. Is Emma happy here? Victoria asked. Very. She loves home, loves having space, loves. And is there any behavior you've observed that could be concerning? Nightmares? Anxiety? Regression? No, she's thriving. Grades have improved. She's made friends. She's a happy and well-adjusted child. That will be checked. I'll need to interview Emma, separately. Without you or her father present, you'll scare her. She won't understand why she's being questioned. It's standard protocol, Ms. Chen. And the more cooperative you are, the faster the process moves forward. Finally, after half an hour of inspection and questioning, Victoria prepared to leave. I'll schedule interviews with Emma and with Sheriff Cole, and I'll review the original incident records from a year ago. A full investigation will take 2 to 3 weeks. And in the meantime, Sophie asked, her voice trembling now because she was processing the magnitude of it all. It's recommended that you limit contact with Emma, not alone, always with an additional adult present, until the investigation is complete. Are you telling me to stay away from a child I help raise, that I love? I'm saying that to protect the integrity of the investigation and ensure Emma's safety. Temporary limitations are appropriate. Victoria handed her a card. If you have any questions, call the office and expect to be contacted to schedule an additional interview. And she left, leaving Sophie standing in a room that had been a sanctuary, that suddenly felt like a trap. Processing. Someone had filed a report, a malicious accusation designed to destroy the family she and Ethan had built. Who, why, and what did it mean? Sophie picked up the phone, her hands trembling. She called Ethan. He answered. Sophie, what happened? Because she could hear panic in his voice. Child Protective Services came. Someone filed a report, saying I have an inappropriate interest in Emma. They're investigating, and they told me to stay away from her until they figure it out. Silence. Then, I'm going home now. Don't talk to anyone else until we talk. Understood. Understood. And Sophie realized the past never truly died. An accusation from a year ago, even proven false, even publicly vindicated, had left a permanent mark, a stain on her record that could be used as a weapon. And someone, somewhere, still wanted to destroy her. And this time, they wouldn't just go after her reputation or her job. They would go after her family. After Emma. After the life Sophie had finally built, and if victorious, they would separate Emma from her permanently. And they would prove that Sophie should never have dared to believe she deserved happiness. That outsiders don't get happy endings. That kindness is always punished eventually. And Sophie would have to decide. Fight knowing that fighting could hurt Emma even more. Or retreat and lose everything that mattered to protect the child she loved. Look, if you've made it this far with Meth, you felt every moment of this journey with Sophie and Ethan. If your heart ached when Sophie was unjustly accused, if you felt relief when Ethan chose to protect her, even at the cost of everything, if you believed along with them that they had finally found peace, you know that this story is about much more than romance or criminal investigation or small town. It's about what happens when we choose to be kind in a world that often punishes kindness. When we choose to see humanity in people that society has already decided are suspect. When we build family, not through blood or convention, but through the daily decision to show up for each other, even when it's difficult, even when it's risky, even when the past keeps trying to destroy the future we are building. And what Sophie faces now, a renewed accusation designed to separate her from Emma. An investigation that transforms love into suspicion. An impossible decision between fighting and potentially harming the child she loves, or retreating and losing everything's. The ultimate test, not of whether she did something wrong, but of whether the world will finally allow outsiders to have a happy ending. Whether kindness can eventually be rewarded instead of punished. Whether a family built on choice can survive against a system that only recognizes blood. And Sophie will have to be braver than ever. She will have to trust not only Ethan, but herself. She will have to believe that it's worth fighting for happiness, even when every instinct screams to protect herself through retreat. And Ethan will have to decide whether the badge he carries can be used to protect his family, or whether the system he swore to serve will be used against them. If this kind of story resonates with you, if you believe that people like Sophie deserve to be seen and protected, if you understand that family is defined by love and not biology, if you want to follow journeys about kindness being rewarded even when the path is brutal, subscribing here is the way to continue walking with me. Because there are thousands of stories like Sophie and Ethan's. Ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Outsiders fighting to belong. Families being built through crisis. And kindness eventually winning. And telling these stories, celebrating these victories, acknowledging these struggles, is how we remind each other that it's worth taking risks. That it's worth stopping in the rain when you see a lost child. That it's worth protecting someone even when it costs you, your reputation. That it's worth building a family even when the past tries to destroy the future. And I need to know, are you with Sophie? Are you with Ethan, who risked everything to protect a woman he barely knew? Do you believe Emma deserves to grow up in a family that loves her? even when family doesn't seem traditional. Then comment below. I'm with you until the end. Let me see how many people truly understand that struggles like Sophie's against systems that judge before knowing, against deeply ingrained prejudices, against accusations that persist even when proven false, are struggles that matter, that deserve to be seen, that need to be won. Because every victory Sophie wins is a victory for every person who has ever been unjustly judged. Every time Ethan chooses humanity over protocol, it's a reminder that authority can be used to protect instead of oppress. And every time Emma says "I love you" to Sophie, it's proof that family is a choice, not an obligation. If this touched you in any way, if at any point you felt anger at how Sophie was treated, if you felt hope when Ethan showed up at her apartment, if you felt joy when they said yes to a future together, if you felt terror when the social workers showed up with renewed accusations, leave a like so I know. Because stories like this need to be told. Truths about how the system fails, vulnerable people need to be exposed. And the more we recognize and support people making the right choices, even at the cost of everything, the more we encourage others to do the same. The more we create a world where kindness is the norm, not the exception. Where helping a lost child is celebrated, not suspected. Where building family through love is honored, not questioned. And there's a video over here that continues in the same vein. Another story of an ordinary person making an extraordinary choice. Of a law enforcement officer choosing humanity over protocol. Of a family being built on a foundation of shared crisis, of love that is real because it is tested, not because it is easy. About protection that is demonstrated through consistent action, not empty words. About transformation that happens when we finally find someone who sees us really, sees us and chooses to stay even when everyone else has left. Click and follow me there. Because journeys like Sophie and Ethan's, where the past tries to destroy the future, but love proves stronger. Where false accusations are eventually exposed, but scars remain. Where families redefined through the daily choice to show up are exactly the kind of stories we need. Stories that remind us why it's worth believing in people. Why it's worth taking risks. Why it's worth stopping when you see someone who needs help, even when the world tells you to keep going. And I want you with me for each and every one of them. Because these stories matter, and you matter. And together, we can celebrate the kindness that still exists in a world that often makes it seem like it's disappeared.